The hospital intake form had a line for current address. Ruth Calloway stared at it for 4 seconds. The pen didn't move. The fluorescent light above the admissions desk buzzed at a frequency that matched the ringing in her ears, and the young nurse behind the counter was kind enough to pretend she hadn't noticed the pause. Ruth wrote the address of the Maple Street shelter. Not a home, a building with beds and rules and a sign-in sheet, but it had a zip code, and right now a zip code was all the form required. She handed the clipboard back and turned to look through the glass partition into the hallway. Caleb was still there, 15 years old, standing with his back against the wall, a backpack over one shoulder that held everything he owned in the world. He wasn't looking at his phone. He didn't have one anymore. He was just standing there the way kids stand when they're trying not to look scared, spine straight, jaw set, eyes tracking every person who walked past him without stopping. He was wearing the green jacket she'd bought him 2 Christmases ago. The zipper on the left pocket was broken. She'd meant to fix it. The doctor said 6 weeks minimum, possibly 8. Blood pressure unstable, the stress-related deterioration of her prior injury, compounding into something that needed monitoring and rest in a controlled environment. He said the words carefully, the way doctors do when they're telling you something serious and watching your face to see how much of it you can hold. Ruth held all of it. She was a nurse, had been for 17 years in the same building 3 floors up. She knew what unstable blood pressure looked like from the inside of the chart and from the inside of the body, and she knew that what he was describing was not catastrophic, but was not nothing either. She nodded at the right moments, asked the right questions. And when he stepped out to get the admission paperwork, she sat on the edge of the examination table in her street clothes and looked at her hands. The left one, the costly one, 3 surgeries, 18 months of physical therapy, a careful return to limited duty that had lasted 14 months before the hospital quietly informed her that light-duty positions were being restructured and her role no longer had a clinical pathway that matched her restrictions. They gave her a severance number and a form to sign. She signed it because she was tired and because Caleb had a dentist appointment that Thursday and she needed to be there for it. That was 22 months ago. She pressed her thumb against the scar tissue on her palm. Still numb in patches, still hers. When the nurse came back with the admissions paperwork, Ruth asked for 1 minute, walked to the glass partition, pushed open the door to the hallway. Caleb looked up. She didn't have time for everything she wanted to say. She could see it in the doctor's posture through the glass that he was waiting. She could feel the 6 weeks pressing down on her like weather. She took Caleb's face in both her hands, good hand and bad, and she looked at him directly. "Don't disappear on me," she said. "Whatever you do, find someone real." He nodded, that jaw-set, spine-straight nod that meant he understood more than she'd said. She went back inside. He was still standing in the hallway when they wheeled her to the elevator. She watched him through the gap in the closing doors until the floor number started changing and the hallway was gone. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from not sleeping. It comes from fighting. Not the kind of fighting that involves raised voices or clenched fists. The kind that involves phone calls on hold for 40 minutes, form letters with no return address, clerks who look at their screens when you're talking and say things like, "Unfortunately at this time, and we understand your frustration, and there's nothing further we can do at the county level." Ruth Calloway had been fighting that fight for 14 months. It had started with a form, a 20-page housing assistance application she'd filled out on the kitchen table of the apartment on Ironwood Hollow while Caleb did his homework across from her. She was methodical about it. She was a nurse. She understood documentation. She gathered everything they asked for: tax records, medical verification, discharge, summary from the hospital, proof of prior employment, proof of current income, which was minimal and documented and real. She submitted it in March, received confirmation in April, was assigned a position on the McDowell County Housing Assistance waitlist number 214. The county estimated 18 to 24 months. She did the math. She had enough for 14 months of rent if she was careful, and Caleb didn't grow out of anything important and nothing broke. She was careful. He grew 2 inches. The refrigerator compressor died in November. She got to position 32. 2 weeks before her number was scheduled to come up, 2 weeks, she'd been counting days she received a letter. It came in a standard county envelope, the kind with the American flag in the corner, and the return address printed in block letters. Inside was a single page on official letterhead. The language was formal and passive and almost impossible to understand if you weren't used to bureaucratic documentation. But Ruth was, so she read it twice and understood exactly what it said. Administrative correction. Eligibility reevaluation required based on updated assessment criteria. New waitlist position, 232. She had been moved backward 200 slots. She read it a third time because she thought she might have misread it. She hadn't. At the bottom of the letter in the signature block was a name: Douglas Parrish, McDowell County Commissioner. Ruth sat with that letter for a long time, then she picked up the phone. Over the next 3 weeks, she made 11 calls to the commissioner's office. She spoke to 3 different administrative assistants, each of whom took her name and number and said someone would follow up. No one followed up. She went to the county building in person twice. The first time she was told Commissioner Parrish was in a meeting. The second time she was told he was traveling. The third time she brought the letter in a folder with her full application documentation and asked to speak to anyone in the housing division with authority to review her case. She was given a form to complete. The form asked her to explain in 200 words or less why she believed the administrative correction had been made in error. She wrote 400 words, and they gave her back the form with a sticky note that said 200 words, maximum please. She rewrote it. 200 words, every one of them precise. 3 weeks later, she received a form letter. Thank you for your inquiry. Administrative corrections are conducted in accordance with county housing assessment protocols. The review process for your inquiry is ongoing. We appreciate your patience. There was no name on it, no signature, just the county seal. Ruth's pastor, a careful and decent man named Reverend Aldous Greer at First Baptist Church of Welch, wrote a letter on church letterhead. 2 members of the congregation who worked at the county building made inquiries through internal channels. A legal aid organization told her they had an 11-week intake backlog and couldn't open an emergency file without a confirmed permanent address. The landlord gave her 60 days. She used 58 of them. On the 59th day, with 4 bags of belongings on the sidewalk outside the apartment they'd lived in for 6 years, Ruth Calloway understood something she hadn't fully understood before. Not as a concept, not as something she'd read about or heard about from patients in difficult circumstances. She understood it as a physical sensation, the way you understand cold when you're standing in it. The system hadn't failed her. Systems fail by accident, through neglect, through underfunding, through the accumulation of small errors made by people who are trying and falling short. What had happened to her was different. What had happened to her was precise. Someone had looked at her file, assessed its value to someone with more leverage than she had, and moved her out of the way, deliberately, with a signature. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the 4 bags and felt the shape of that understanding settle into her bones alongside the cold. Then she picked up the bags and started moving. Caleb had been on the street for 3 weeks before the night of the storm. He'd lasted 4 days in the youth shelter on Tanner Road. It wasn't that it was dangerous exactly. It was clean enough and the staff weren't unkind. But there was something about the place, the way every person in it got reduced to a case number, the way your belongings got inventoried when you arrived, the way the day was structured in blocks of time that someone else had decided the shape of that felt less like safety and more like erasure. He left before dawn on the 5th day with his backpack and his mother's voice in his head, find someone real. He wasn't sure what real looked like. He knew what it didn't look like. It didn't look like a sign-in sheet. It didn't look like a caseworker who typed while you talked. For 3 weeks, he moved through Welch like water finding its level. He knew which gas stations didn't check the bathroom every hour. He knew which church basements left the side door unlocked on Wednesday nights after the choir practice. He knew the parking structure on 4th and Morgan had a third-floor corner that stayed dry even in heavy rain, and that the heating vent on the east wall ran warm from about 10 at night until 6 in the morning. He ate when he could. He didn't eat enough, but he didn't starve. He kept himself clean as circumstances allowed. He kept his jacket zipped and his head down, and he did not stop moving because stopping felt like the beginning of becoming invisible. He thought about his mother every day. He called the hospital from a payphone outside the Quick Mart on Route 16 on the 4th day, and they told him she was stable and resting and not accepting calls. He called again on the 9th day, and they said the same thing. He stopped calling because the calls cost $1 each, and because the word stable repeated began to feel like a door being politely closed. He was doing his homework. This is worth saying because it is easy to construct a version of those 3 weeks that is only about survival, only about cold and hunger and the mechanics of staying one step ahead of nothing. But Caleb Calloway was 15 and a good student, and he went to school 6 of the days he was on the street because school was warm and no one asked where he'd slept, and the library opened at 7:30. And Mr. Hennessy, his English teacher, left the classroom unlocked during his free period if you needed somewhere quiet. He was doing his homework. He was also listening. 23 days before the night of the storm, Caleb was on the 3rd floor of the parking structure on 4th and Morgan. It was a Sunday, cold but dry. He'd found a thermal undershirt in the Goodwill donation bin outside the Methodist Church on Canary Street, and he was wearing it under his green jacket, and he was almost comfortable, which was as much as he asked for on a Sunday. He wasn't trying to listen, he was trying to sleep. But the parking structure was open on the sides, just concrete columns and a low wall, and the acoustics of the space were strange, the way concrete carries sound, the way a voice from below can travel upward through a gap in the floor and arrive with unexpected clarity, as if the speaker were in the same room. The voice came from 1 floor below near the east stairwell. It was a man's voice, even measured the voice of someone accustomed to speaking carefully in official settings. The kind of voice that had spent years in rooms where everything said was recorded or remembered. Caleb didn't move. He lay on his side with his jacket pulled up, and he listened. "The correction gets processed this week," the voice said. "Ridgeline closes the corridor by Thursday. Same timeline as Pinewood." A pause. 11 years. Nobody has ever looked at a waitlist correction twice. Another pause, longer. The voice was on a phone call. Caleb could hear only this side of it. 372-400. Wire it in 3rd, same as Pinewood. You know the account. A shorter pause. And the Briggs file from 2009, it stays closed. There is nothing left to find. The call ended. Caleb heard footsteps on the stairwell, a car door, an engine, then nothing. He lay still for a long time. He didn't have a pen, he didn't have paper, he didn't have a phone to type it into or a recording of any kind. What he had was the kind of memory that develops in people who grow up having to hold important information in their heads because there's nowhere else to put it. He said the numbers out loud quietly to himself. 372-400, wire in 3rds, same as Pinewood. He said the name, Briggs file, 2009, stays closed. He said them until they were grooves in his mind, a track that would play whether he wanted it to or not. He didn't know what it meant. He didn't know who the man was. He hadn't seen a face. He'd heard a voice and a set of numbers and a name that meant nothing to him yet. But something about the phrase stays closed felt wrong in the specific way that things feel wrong when you've spent 3 weeks living on the outside of every door that should have been open to you. He repeated the words every night before he slept. Like a prayer he didn't understand. Like something he was keeping safe until he knew what it was for. The storm came on a Tuesday. It came the way storms come in the West Virginia mountains in February. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, and from everywhere sleet and freezing rain and a wind that moved through the streets of Welch like something looking for a reason to stay. Caleb had a system for bad weather. The parking structure was exposed on the sides. The shelter on Tanner Road was dry, but cost him something he didn't want to spend. The best option in a genuine storm was the ground floor entrance hall of McDowell County General. The sliding doors that opened automatically, the long corridor past the gift shop that led to the main elevator bank. Hospital security generally left you alone if you were sitting in a chair with something to read and you didn't look like you were sleeping. He got there around 9, found a chair in the corridor near the gift shop, a magazine from the rack with a torn cover. He'd been there maybe 20 minutes when the outer doors slid open and a big man came through them. The man was moving fast, which was the first thing Caleb noticed. Not running, but the kind of walking that is trying not to become running the controlled speed of someone who is managing something urgent and managing it alone. He was large, broad through the shoulders, wearing a leather vest over a flannel shirt, despite the cold, gray-streaked beard and a scar on the left side of his jaw that ran from below his ear to somewhere near his chin. He moved like someone accustomed to physicality, like someone for whom the body had always been a tool. He was holding the hand of a child. The girl was maybe 2 years old. She was wearing a leather vest that was so large on her, it covered her hands and dragged past her knees. She walked at speed beside the man with those wistoy, slightly bow-legged steps that toddlers use when they're trying to keep up with adults, and she wasn't crying, which Caleb thought was strange for a child that small being moved through a hospital at that kind of pace. They reached the admissions desk. The man bent down and said something to the girl, one hand on her shoulder. The girl looked at him steadily. Then the man straightened up, took one step toward the desk, and stopped. He didn't fall immediately. It was more like the infrastructure of the moment gave way, like something inside the architecture of how he was holding himself released all at once. He caught himself on the edge of the desk, then went down to one knee, then onto his side. A nurse appeared, then 2 nurses, then a doctor who had been walking past. The girl stood very still in the middle of the activity. She was wearing the enormous vest. Her hands were hidden inside the sleeves. She watched the man on the floor with dark, steady eyes and did not make a sound. Caleb had stood up without deciding to. He moved to the edge of the activity. The medical staff were focused on the man pulse response airway, and no one was looking at the girl. She was standing 2 feet from all of it, small and still and absolutely alone. Caleb crouched down to her level. She looked at him. "Hey," he said. "What's your name?" "Gracie," she said. He looked at the man on the floor. The nurses were calling for a gurney. The man's eyes were open, but not focusing correctly, moving in the way eyes move when the brain is trying to recalibrate. "Is that your dad?" Caleb asked. "Daddy," Gracie said. The man on the floor moved his head. His eyes found Caleb's face with an effort that was visible. His lips moved. Caleb leaned closer. "Find the angels," the man said. His voice was rough, air thin. "She knows where." Then his eyes closed and the gurney arrived, and the medical staff moved around him with that specific efficiency that means things are serious but not yet lost. And someone in scrubs said, "We need to clear the area," and Caleb found himself stepping back. He looked at Gracie. She was looking at the doors, not the admissions desk, not the man being lifted onto the gurney. The outer sliding doors, the ones that led back into the storm. "Daddy's angels," she said. Caleb looked at the doors. The sleet was visible through the glass, angled hard against the light. He looked at Gracie. She was still watching the doors with that ancient, unhurried steadiness that some very small children have, as if they are receiving information from somewhere adults have stopped being able to hear. He tried to find a nurse who wasn't occupied. He tried to find a security officer. He went to the admissions desk and told the clerk that the child seemed to be alone and unaccounted for. The clerk said someone would be right with him. Someone was not right with him. He went back to Gracie. She was still standing where he'd left her. She looked up at him, then she lifted one hand's sleeve, still hanging past the fingers, and pointed at the sliding doors. "Daddy's angels," she said again, completely certain. Caleb Calloway was 15 years old. He had been on the street for 3 weeks. He had $32 and a broken zippered jacket and a backpack with a change of clothes and a copy of The Outsiders, his English teacher they had given him, because he'd read it 3 times and Mr. Hennessy thought he should own it. He had no reason to believe a 2-year-old girl. He believed her anyway. He crouched down and looked at her. "Okay," he said, "show me." He took off his jacket. It swam on her, but it was waterproof and it was warm and it was what he had. He zipped it up as far as it would go. She stood still and let him do it with the patience of a child who has learned to trust the intentions of this particular sequence of actions. Then he picked her up. She was heavier than she looked. She put her arms around his neck with the matter-of-fact confidence of a child who has decided you are reliable, and she pointed at the doors. He walked through them. 6 miles, 27 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing rain, the wind moving against them the way wind does when it seems personal. Caleb walked. He didn't know where he was going. Gracie knew where she was going. That was the agreement they'd entered into in the hospital corridor, unspoken and binding. She pointed. He walked. When he hesitated at intersections at dark stretches of road where the street lights had gone out, she said, "Daddy's angels," and pointed, and he walked. He was cold within the first quarter mile. Genuinely cold. The kind that doesn't stay on the surface but moves inward, settling into the bones of his shoulders and the meat of his thighs and the specific vulnerability of his fingers. He had no gloves. His left hand was curled around Gracie's back, holding her against his chest, and the rain was finding the gaps in his hoodie with something like determination. He counted steps to stay present. He named things he could see. He repeated under his breath the numbers from the parking garage: 372, 400 wire in thirds, same as Pinewood Briggs file stays closed, because it gave his mind something to grip while his body did the work of moving forward. By the 4th mile, his left hand had stopped hurting. That should have worried him. He was a nurse's son. He knew what it meant when something that should hurt had stopped. But there was nowhere to stop, and Gracie was warm against his chest. He could feel it, even through the hoodie, the animal warmth of her. The slow, steady rhythm of her breathing and the lights she was pointing toward were getting closer. He could see them through the trees, orange-yellow, the kind of light that comes from inside a building that is full of people, the specific warmth of occupied spaces on a cold night. And he could see the vests through a window, men in leather vests sitting and standing in the lit space beyond the glass, and something in the image resolved the 6 miles and the cold and the frostbitten hand into a single coherent thing. This was the place. This was what she'd been pointing at. He found the door and knocked. It opened 11 seconds later. The man who opened it was the size of something architectural. 50 years old, maybe more. Full beard going silver at the edges. Arms covered in ink that disappeared into the light behind him. A leather vest with patches that had been earned over time in ways that were not decorative. His eyes went to Caleb first, then to the bundle against Caleb's chest, and the expression on his face did not change, but his body did. He stepped forward, one arm out. Caleb's knees went. He was aware of this happening without being able to stop it. The ground came up and the big man caught him, and the last thing he said before the ceiling became the floor was what he'd been saying for 6 miles. "She kept saying, 'Daddy's angels,'" Caleb said. "Just followed her." Then the world turned sideways and stopped. He came back to consciousness in pieces. Warmth first, then light, low amber, the kind that doesn't demand anything. Then voices controlled and purposeful, the specific cadence of people who know what they're doing in an emergency. Then the ceiling wood beams, a fan that wasn't moving. A man was on his knees beside him, broad shoulders, a medic bag open on the floor. His hands were at Caleb's wrist, 2 fingers, eyes on his watch. "Pulse check," the man said to no one in particular. Then quieter. "There you are. Stay with me." "Gracie, no," Caleb said. Right here. A different voice, deep, careful. And then the big man who had opened the door was crouching beside him, and in his arms was Gracie, still wearing the enormous leather vest, watching Caleb with those steady dark eyes. "She's okay," the big man said. "Warm, breathing fine. You kept her safe." Caleb looked at her for a long time. His chest rose and fell. "Daddy's angels," Gracie said. Something in Caleb's face moved toward a smile and didn't quite complete the journey. "I know," he said. "You were right." He closed his eyes. "Stay with me," the man with the medic bag said. "Few more minutes, then you could sleep." "Ratchet," someone else said from across the room. "The hand." There was a brief silence. Caleb heard the sound of thermal material being unwrapped, a sharp intake of breath from someone nearby. "Frostbite," the medic said. Calm, professional. 3 fingers, 40 minutes, maybe less, before this becomes permanent. Another voice, older, from somewhere near the back of the room. "Birch, come here." Caleb was aware of movement, of the child's weight transferring somewhere else, of a small card being handled carefully like evidence. Then the room changed, not in volume, in density, the way air changes before something significant. Every person in the room seemed to straighten without moving. The voices stopped. Somewhere a refrigerator hummed. "This is Gracie Briggs," the older voice said, completely still. "That's Stellan's girl." 3 seconds of silence. Sleet hit the windows in waves. Then the big man's voice measured as a ruler. "Where the hell is Stellan?" 12 minutes. The man they called Stellan Briggs moved through the clubhouse door like a problem solving itself. Hospital identification band still on his right wrist. Discharge papers in his left hand folded wrong, like they'd been grabbed rather than gathered. His eyes locked on the big man first, then on the child. His face did something complicated. Relief and something older than relief moving through him like weather through a building. And then he crossed the room in 4 strides, and the big man handed the girl over without ceremony, and Stellan took her with both hands, one cradling her head, the other around her small body, and pressed his forehead against the top of hers. He didn't say anything. Nobody expected him to. Then Gracie's voice muffled against his chest. "Daddy, angels came." His shoulders moved once. Just once. Then he was looking at Caleb on the floor, taking in the soaked hoodie, the frostbitten hand wrapped in thermal blankets, the boots 2 sizes too large soles separating at the front, packed with ice. He looked at the big man. Hound, the others called him, a former county detective who had walked off the job 15 years ago, the day his department buried a child welfare complaint he'd escalated, and who had been wearing this patch ever since. 6 miles, Hound said, in the storm. After you went down at the hospital. Stellan's jaw worked. He looked back at Caleb. The boy's eyes were open, watching him steady despite the exhaustion and the cold and the fluorescent unreality of the past hour. "You heard me," Stellan said, not a question. "You said find the angels," Caleb said. "She knew where she was alone. She was scared." Caleb's voice was thin but direct. "I couldn't leave her there." Stellan Briggs knelt slowly, Gracie still in his arms, and got down to Caleb's level. He stayed there, looking at the boy the way you look at something you don't fully have language for yet. "What's your name?" "Caleb. Caleb Calloway." "Caleb." He let the name settle. "You know what you did tonight?" Caleb's eyes moved to Gracie, then back. "I just walked." "You walked 6 miles through freezing rain without a jacket. You've got frostbite. You're hypothermic. You almost died. For a child you didn't know?" Caleb didn't answer. Stellan reached out with the hand that wasn't holding Gracie and placed it on the boy's shoulder. Firm, steady, the kind of contact that means something specific in a room full of men who understand it. "You brought my daughter home safe," Stellan said. "You hear me? That means something in this room. That means something to every person here." Caleb nodded once. His eyes were closing again. "Let him rest," Ratchet said. Grady Fenn, 48 years old, combat medic, 2 tours in Iraq, 6 years as a civilian, EMT, 12 years riding with this chapter. He had kept his certification current because he had seen too many times what happened when help arrived 3 minutes too late. He's stable, hands rewarming, he needs sleep. Stellan stood. He looked at the room. At Ratchet beside the cot at Birchlisle Maddox, 43 years old, former middle school counselor, who had left education after reporting a suspected abuse case that the school board declined to act on, sitting now with the birthday card in his hands, studying it carefully. At Sketch Ren Cawley, 28 years old, the chapter's technology specialist, already at a folding table with a laptop open. "Where did he come from?" Stellan asked. "Don't know the Bell story yet," Hound said. "Dex Whitmore, 51, the man who had opened the door. 3 weeks on the street by the look of him. Split lip, bruising, eviction. That'd be my read." "How old?" 15, maybe 16, and Stellan went still. 15 years old, on the street. The same age Addie would be now if things had gone differently in 2009. The daughter whose custody file had closed while Stellan was still trying to get stable enough to bring her home. The daughter who existed now only in a photograph and in the particular weight of an unanswered question that had sat in his chest for 15 years. He looked at Caleb, at the boy sleeping on the floor with the complete exhaustion of someone who had not felt safe enough to rest in a long time. The system had failed Stellan once. It had just tried to fail this boy the same way. "I want his story," Stellan said. His voice had gone flat and presidential. "Full story soon as he's awake. Where he's been, who failed him, how he ended up on that street." "We'll get it," Hound said. "Good." Stellan looked down at Gracie. She was fading, head heavy against his chest, small hand loosely holding the lapel of his vest. The birthday card was still in the vest pocket. He could see the corner of it, the ink smeared blue by the rain. He looked at it. "He doesn't go back to the street," he said. "Not tonight. Not while I'm president of this chapter." "Understood." The room was quiet. Outside, the storm moved through Welch without hurry or apology, the way weather moves through a place that doesn't have the resources to argue with it. The sleet had shifted to something closer to snow, heavier, slower, the kind that accumulates. At 2:17 in the morning, Caleb's eyes opened. The room had thinned out. Low lights. Most of the brothers had gone home. 4 people still. There, Ratchet near the small kitchen, cleaning instruments with the automatic precision of long habit. Birch in a chair against the wall, not quite asleep. Sketch at a folding table with a laptop open, documenting something. And Stellan. Stellan was in a wooden chair beside the cot. He'd been there for 3 hours. Gracie was on a separate cot 6 feet away, piled in blankets, breathing soft and even. Stellan was sitting forward, elbows on his knees, hands loosely clasped, watching the space between himself and Caleb the way you watch something you're not sure is going to hold. "Hey," Stellan said. "Hey," Caleb said. His voice was rough, unused. "How do you feel?" "Warm." A pause. "Good." "Good is good?" Stellan leaned back slightly. "You remember what happened?" "Most of it. Hospital. The storm. Your daughter." Caleb looked at the cot where Gracie was sleeping. "She's okay. She's fine because of you." Caleb looked away. "I just walked." "Stop saying that." Caleb looked back. "Most people," Stellan said, and his voice had the kind of flatness that comes not from coldness, but from precision, from wanting to be exactly accurate, would have called someone, or walked away, or convinced themselves it wasn't their problem. You picked her up and walked 6 miles in the worst storm we've had all winter. That is not what anyone would do. That's what you did. And I need you to understand that that matters." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at his left hand, still wrapped in the thermal bandaging fingers resting against his chest. "Will it be okay?" "Ratchet says yes. No permanent damage if we keep you warm and rested for 48 hours. You got lucky." Caleb nodded. "I don't feel lucky." "No," Stellan said. "I know that feeling." They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the storm had quieted to win. "Caleb," Stellan said, "I need to know what happened to you, where you've been, how you ended up at that hospital tonight." Caleb's shoulders pulled in slightly, a small automatic contraction, the posture of someone who has learned that adults who ask questions are usually gathering information that will be used against you later. Stellan saw it, recognized it. He'd worn that posture himself 15 years ago in rooms not unlike this one. "I'm not a cop," Stellan said. "I'm not with the county. I'm not going to call anyone you don't want called. But I can't help you if I don't know what I'm helping with. And right now, that's what I want to do." Caleb looked at him for a long time, searching for the lie, for the angle, for the reason this was going to turn into something worse, the way everything had turned into something worse for 3 weeks. He didn't find it. So he started talking. He told it straight, the way he'd learned to tell things, no decoration, no appeal for sympathy, just the shape of what happened. The 14 months his mother had been on the wait list. The letter with the administrative correction. 200 slots backward and a name at the bottom. Douglas Parrish. Stellan's hands tightened slightly, almost imperceptibly where they were clasped. Caleb told him about the appeals that went nowhere. The phone calls, the form letters, the legal aid office with the 11-week backlog, the eviction, his mother's collapse and admission to the hospital, the same hospital he said 4 floors above, where Stellan had found him in the corridor tonight. Stellan went very still at that. 4 floors above. Ruth Calloway had been in that building all night. Her son had sheltered in its lobby, had found Gracie. There had walked 6 miles through a storm and back without knowing his mother was 4 floors up in the same building, unable to look for him. Caleb told him about the 4 days in the shelter and then the street. Then he stopped. "There's something else," Stellan said. Not a question. He'd been watching Caleb's face. Caleb closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there was something deliberate in his expression, the look of someone about to hand something valuable to someone they've just decided to trust. 23 days ago, Caleb said, "I was sleeping in the parking structure on 4th and Morgan, 3rd floor. There was a man in the stairwell below me on the phone. I could hear him through a gap in the floor." Stellan said nothing. Caleb spoke slowly in the exact cadence he'd been repeating to himself every night for 23 nights. He said the correction gets processed this week. Ridgeline closes the corridor Thursday. Then he said, 11 years nobody has ever looked at a waitlist correction twice. Then he said 372-400. Wire it in thirds, same as Pinewood. The room was very quiet. And then Caleb said, "He said something I didn't understand, but I think you do." Stellan's face had gone completely expressionless. The kind of stillness that is not the absence of feeling, but the maximum containment of it. "What did he say?" Caleb looked at him directly. He said the Briggs file from 2009 stays closed. There is nothing left to find. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere Ratchet set down a metal instrument with a small, precise sound. Sketch stopped, typing. Birch, who had been half asleep in his chair, sat up straight. Stellan did not move, did not speak, did not blink. He looked at Caleb the way you look at something that has just said, in a language you've been trying to translate for 15 years, the sentence you needed to hear. "You're sure?" he said. His voice was barely above a murmur. "The Briggs file, 2009. "I didn't have anything to write with," Caleb said. "I just repeated it every night. I don't know what it means. I still don't." Stellan stood up slowly. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark and the snow that had replaced the sleet and the hollow that spread out below Coalfield Road, black and quiet, and holding whatever it had always held. He stood there a long time. When he spoke, his voice was even, controlled. The kind of control that is not easy. "The Briggs file," he said, still facing the window. "That's my family, 2009, the year I lost everything." He paused. "My house, my daughter's custody, my brother Derek when the county placed him in a developmental services facility, and then closed his file without a forwarding address. The year Douglas Parrish, who was a mid-level housing official, back then not yet commissioner, processed the correction that moved my family out of our slot. Another pause. The year everything that could be taken was taken, and the file that explained how was sealed. Caleb was quiet. "He's been doing this for 15 years, he said finally. "Low certain. At least," Stellan said. "Your family wasn't the first. Mine wasn't either." He turned from the window. His expression was different now. Not angry exactly. Something beneath anger. Something that had been waiting in a specific room inside him for 15 years, patient and cold and ready. He looked at Hound, who had come back into the room at some point without Caleb noticing. "Call Ironside," Stellan said. "Burl Mackay, 60 years old war chief of the Tri-County Alliance of Chapters, the man whose road name had been earned rather than chosen. Tell him I need 3 chapters. 6 a.m. County Building parking lot." He paused. "Tell him it's the Briggs file. He'll understand." Hound already had his phone out. Stellan walked to the cot where Gracie was sleeping. He looked at her for a long moment, touched her forehead once gently. Then he looked at Caleb. "Get some sleep," he said. "When you wake up, we start." "Start what?" Stellan picked up his vest from the back of the chair. Put it on, checked his phone. 12 texts from brothers in 3 chapters, all variants of the same question, "You good?" He typed one answer, sent it to all of them. "Good. 6 a.m. County Building. It's time." He put the phone in his pocket. "Taking back what was stolen," he said. "Not just from you, from everyone." He walked to the door, stopped, one hand on the frame. "Caleb." The boy looked up. "You said your mother's in the hospital. McDowell County General." "Yes." "What room?" Caleb blinked. "I don't know. They wouldn't tell me when I called. I didn't know I was in the lobby the whole time. I didn't know she was up there." Stellan was quiet for a moment. "She raised you to pick up a child in a storm and walk 6 miles without asking what was in it for you." Caleb didn't answer, because there was nothing to answer. It was true. "She sounds like someone real," Stellan said. Then he walked out into the cold. Behind him, Caleb closed his eyes. 4 floors up in the same building where Caleb had found Gracie, 4 floors up in the hospital where Ruth Calloway had worked for 17 years before the system she had served looked at her file and moved her 200 steps backward. Ruth lay awake looking at the ceiling. She didn't know what her son had done that night. She didn't know about the storm or the 6 miles or the small girl in the enormous vest or the man with the scar who had knelt on the floor and told her son that it mattered. She didn't know that the name on the letter Douglas Parrish, the name she'd said out loud 11 times on hold and twice in person, to people who looked at their screens, had just been spoken in a room full of men who knew what to do with it. She just lay there in the dark with her bandaged hand resting on the hospital blanket and thought about what Caleb had looked like through the glass, partition spine, straight, jaw-set backpack on one shoulder, watching every person who walked past without stopping, waiting, holding, not disappearing. She closed her eyes. Outside the hospital, the storm had gone quiet. Just wind now moving through Welch the way wind moves through a place that has decided to wait for morning. And 6 miles away in a building with a birthday card in a pocket and a man who had just made 12 phone calls, something that had been locked for 15 years, had begun slowly and without ceremony to open. The rumble started at 5:47 in the morning. Douglas Parrish heard it from his bedroom on Ridgeview Drive before he was fully awake. A low directional sound, the kind that doesn't come from weather or machinery, but from something organized, something with intention behind it. He lay still for a moment listening, and then the sound grew and divided, coming from the north now, and from the east, and from somewhere down the valley that he couldn't place, and he sat up. He went to the window. Ridgeview Drive was empty. The snow from the night before had settled on the pavement, and the car roofs and the bare branches of the oaks along the easement, and in the early dark, it all had the clean, muffled look of a morning that hadn't been used yet. Nothing moving, no lights, but the sound kept growing. He stood at the window for 3 minutes. By the time he turned away to get dressed, he could feel the vibration through the glass. By 6:02, the first column appeared on Garrison Street. 67 motorcycles, 2 by 2, moving through the center of Welch like a military formation. Engines synchronized in a way that doesn't happen by accident. That kind of synchronization is rehearsed, internalized. The product of men who have ridden together long enough to breathe at the same tempo. Every rider's eyes forward. No one looking at the storefronts or the traffic signals or the few early pedestrians who stopped on the sidewalk and stared. They turned into the county building parking lot and cut their engines in waves row by row until the only sound left was the hiss of cooling metal and the wind moving through the gaps between bikes. By 6:19, there were 112. By 6:31, 176. By 6:47, exactly 200 motorcycles occupied every available foot of the McDowell County building parking lot arranged in rows of geometric precision. 200 men stood beside them, not moving, not talking, not carrying signs or banners or anything that could be confiscated or documented as incitement. Just present, the security guard, a man named Morris Doyle who had worked the county building for 9 years and had seen most of what a county building sees, stood at the front entrance with his phone in his hand and his coffee going cold on the ledge beside him, and stared. He had called his supervisor at 6:15. His supervisor had told him to call the Welch Police Department. He had called the Welch Police Department at 6:18. The officer on duty had listened to his description and said nobody's breaking any law. They're standing in a parking lot. Call us if something changes. Something had not changed. They were just standing there. Morris looked at the front row. One man stood at the center of it, arms crossed over his chest, expression as neutral as the sky. Large gray-bearded scar running along the left jaw. He was looking at the building's front entrance with the patient, specific attention of someone who has waited a long time for something and has finally arranged the conditions for it to happen. Morris thought about saying something to him. He picked up his coffee. He put it down. He did not say anything. 14 miles away in a room on the 4th floor of McDowell County General, a nurse named Patricia Reeves came in at 7:05 to check Ruth Calloway's blood pressure. Ruth was already awake. She had been awake for most of the night. Patricia wrapped the cuff, pumped it, read the number, wrote it down. Still elevated, but less than yesterday. Moving in the right direction. "You need to sleep," Patricia said. She said it the way nurses say things they know won't be listened to but feel obligated to say anyway. "I know," Ruth said. Patricia left. Ruth lay in the semi-dark and looked at the ceiling tiles and thought about Caleb. She had been thinking about Caleb since midnight, and she would keep thinking about him until she knew where he was and that he was okay, and there was no ceiling tile in the world interesting enough to compete with that. At 7:40, the door opened and Noreen Calloway came in. Noreen was Ruth's sister-in-law, her late husband, Garrett's younger sister, 48 years old, a practical woman from Savannah who wore her hair short and her opinions plainly, and who had driven 7 hours from Georgia the day before when a neighbor of Ruth's had tracked down her number and told her what was happening. She had the look of someone who had slept badly and was pretending she hadn't, and she was carrying 2 cups of coffee from the machine down the hall, and her expression when she looked at Ruth was the particular expression of someone about to say something they've been rehearsing since before they arrived. She set 1 coffee on the bedside table. She sat down. She said, "I need to tell you about last night." Ruth listened. She was good at listening. 17 years in clinical settings had trained her to take in information without letting her face perform her reaction, to hold what she was hearing at a slight remove so that the information could settle into its proper shape before she responded to it. She had listened to diagnoses and disclosures and family conversations in hallways that would have broken most people, and she had held all of it with steadiness. She was less steady now, but she held it. She listened to Noreen describe the phone call she'd received early that morning from a man who said his name was Hound, who explained that her nephew had been found at a Hells Angels clubhouse on Coalfield Road, 6 miles from the county hospital, hypothermic and frostbitten and unconscious. Having walked that distance in the worst storm of the season, carrying a 2-year-old child he'd found at the hospital's emergency entrance. She listened to the part about the child, about the vest, about the birthday card with the name Briggs, and the room going quiet, and the man named Stellan arriving 12 minutes later with a hospital band still on his wrist. She listened to Noreen describe what Caleb was doing right now, sleeping on a cot in the clubhouse, frostbitten, hand-rewrapped temperature, normal, someone named Ratchet monitoring him through the night. She listened to all of it. When Noreen stopped talking, Ruth was quiet for 90 seconds. Then she pushed back the blanket and swung her legs over the side of the bed. "Ruth, hand me my clothes, your blood pressure." "Noreen," Ruth looked at her, not unkind, not negotiating. "My son is in a building with strangers because I couldn't keep a roof over our heads. The man whose signature took that roof away has apparently been doing it to families in this county for 15 years. And from what you're describing, there are 200 people standing in a parking lot right now who know it." She paused. "My blood pressure is not what needs managing this morning." Noreen looked at her for a long moment. Then she went to the closet and got Ruth's clothes. The nurse on duty came in while Ruth was buttoning her jacket and started talking about the risks of OEM discharge and the importance of continued monitoring, and Ruth listened to all of it with full attention and then said, "I understand. I need a form to sign." The form was produced. Ruth signed it with her right hand, the good one in clear and legible script. She walked out of the hospital at 8:20, Noreen's spare jacket over her own, the bandage on her left wrist visible at the cuff. She had every intention of returning once the day's work was done, and she would that afternoon, allowing the doctor to readmit her for the remaining days of monitoring he required. But this morning there was somewhere she needed to be first. Noreen's car moved through Welch in the early morning light, past the gas stations and the closed storefronts and the Baptist church on 4th Street, where Reverend Greer had written a letter that went unanswered, and when it turned onto the block facing the county building, Ruth saw them. 200 motorcycles. 200 men in leather vests standing beside them in the cold in rows so precise they seemed to have been drawn there. The parking lot was full from the entrance to the back wall, the bikes glittering with frost in the thin winter sun. Ruth looked at the lot for a long moment through the car window. Then she opened the door and stepped out. She moved through the rows of parked bikes toward the front of the formation. The men she passed glanced at her and said nothing, reading her with the particular attention of people trained to assess a situation before reacting. A woman in borrowed clothes with a bandaged wrist and a face that had not slept and was not going to apologize for it. She reached the front row. Stellan Briggs was standing at its center, arms crossed, watching the county building entrance. He heard her footsteps and turned. He looked at her, she looked at him. He knew who she was without being told. He'd spent 3 hours with her son. He'd heard the name, heard the shape of the story. He could see the resemblance not in the faces, but in the posture, in the particular quality of stillness that Caleb had, and that clearly came from somewhere. He said nothing. He uncrossed his arms, shifted slightly to the left, made space beside him in the front row. Ruth stepped into the space. Neither of them said a word. They stood side by side in the frozen parking lot of McDowell County, West Virginia, looking at the building that held the office of the man who had signed the letter that had taken everything from her and waited. At 7:53, a reporter from the Welch Gazette named Tom Burkett arrived with a camera and a notebook in the specific energy of a local journalist who has learned through long experience to recognize when a story has found its own shape without any help from him. He took photographs for 5 minutes. Then he approached Stellan. Stellan answered 3 questions in 3 sentences. The County Housing Assistance Program had systematically failed vulnerable families for over a decade. There was evidence of corruption at the administrative level. They were present to ensure that evidence reached the people responsible for acting on it. Burkett asked for more details. Stellan said, "Ask Commissioner Parrish." Then he turned back to face the building and did not speak again. Burkett turned to the woman standing beside him. Ruth looked at the camera. "Oh, She had not prepared anything. There was nothing to prepare. She had been saying this to empty phone lines and unresponsive form letters in a system designed to absorb complaint without response for 14 months. And all of it was right there at the surface, organized and ready, needing only the direct question and a person willing to hold the microphone. "He took our home," she said. Her voice was steady, low, the voice of someone who is not performing grief but reporting it. "He took my health. He almost took my son. And from what I understand this morning, he's been doing it for 15 years to families just like mine. Families who had nothing left to fight with when the letter came." Burkett asked if she could say more. She said everything that needs to be said is in the evidence. Ask Commissioner Parrish. The clip went online at 9:07. By 9:50, it had been shared 460 times. By 10:30, a news van from Charleston was setting up across the street. Inside the county building on the second floor, Douglas Parrish sat at his desk and watched the parking lot through his office window. He had arrived at 6:52, pulling his county-issued SUV into his reserved parking space, the one closest to the entrance, the one with his name on a small metal sign, and walking through 200 pairs of eyes without acknowledging them. He had straightened his coat. He had used the key fob. The beep had echoed across the silent lot like a small announcement. He had not looked back. He was good at not looking back. 23 years in public service had taught him that looking back was an admission, and Douglas Parrish did not make admissions. He made assessments. He managed conditions. He had managed conditions that would have broken lesser men, and he had done it with a clean desk and a warm handshake and a reputation in this county that he had built carefully. One Habitat for Humanity house and one Meals on Wheels shift at a time. His phone had rung 4 times since he arrived, his supervisor wanting to know the nature of the demonstration. He told him it was a peaceful gathering, no cause for concern. He was monitoring the situation. His supervisor asked if he should involve the mayor's office. Douglas said that would only escalate things. His supervisor said, "Keep me updated." Douglas said, "Of course." He hung up and looked at the parking lot. 200 still there, motionless, watching. And in the front row, Stellan Briggs, who Douglas had not seen in 15 years, but whose face he remembered with the specific clarity of a man who has trained himself to remember every face associated with every file he has ever touched. Stellan Briggs, standing in the cold in his Hell's Angels vest, looking at this building with the calm and patient focus of a man who has decided how this ends. Douglas turned from the window and sat down. He folded his hands on his desk and looked at his coffee and thought carefully about every decision he had made over the past 15 years and whether any of them could be recontextualized as something other than what they were. He was still working on that when the footsteps came down the hallway. Stellan didn't knock. He stopped in the open doorway of Douglas Parrish's office at 9:47 in the morning and stood there 6 feet 2 inches, 200 and some pounds leather vest scar along the jaw, controlled in the specific way that things are controlled when enormous force is being applied in one direction, and waited for Douglas to look up. Douglas looked up. "Mr. Briggs," he said. His voice was measured, warm even, the voice he used in public settings and budget meetings, in conversations with constituents he needed to manage. "It's been a long time." 15 years, Stellan said. "You remember." 2009, yes. Douglas leaned back slightly, hands still on the desk, loose, unthreatening. "You had housing difficulties back then. I remember your case. I'm sorry we weren't able to do more." "You did plenty," Stellan said, "just not for me." Douglas's expression did not change. Something behind his eyes shifted, calculating, reassessing, but his face held. "I'm not sure I understand." "Yeah," Stellan said. "You do." He walked into the office. He did not sit. He did not close the door. He stood in the center of the room and looked at Douglas Parrish the way you look at something you have been carrying for a long time and have finally set down in the right place. "I'm here about the wait list corrections," Stellan said. The ones you've been processing for 15 years. The ones that move families out of housing assistance slots in the weeks before development acquisition, deals closed in their quarters. I'm here about the 372,400 that Ridgeline Development Partners wired to your consulting account in 3 installments over the past 14 months. I'm here about Pinewood in the South Welch Corridor and the 14 other transactions I can trace back to the same pattern going to 2009. And I'm here about the Briggs file. Douglas Parrish was very still. His hands, which had been loose on the desk, were not quite as loose. "Mr. Briggs," he said after a moment, patient, reasonable, the voice of a man explaining something obvious to someone who has drawn the wrong conclusion. "Administrative corrections are routine. They happen when our team identifies data entry errors or eligibility discrepancies in the system. It's not a sinister process, it's a bureaucratic one." "You made $372,000 from bureaucracy," Stellan said. Douglas stopped talking. "That's the amount," Stellan continued, "paid by Ridgeline Development Partners over 14 months, wired in 3 installments to Aldridge Consulting Group, which is registered to your wife's maiden name at an address in Bluefield that hasn't had an occupant since 2019. Same method you used for Pinewood Corridor in 2018. Same method you used for South Welch in 2009, when my family's waitlist position disappeared, and my brother Derek ended up in a county developmental services facility that closed his file without a forwarding address." He paused. "Same method, different family, 15 years. Douglas's posture changed. The warmth dropped out of it. What replaced it was something older, the particular stillness of someone deciding how much ground to give up and how fast. "Those are serious allegations," and he said, "Do you have documentation?" "I have a witness who heard you make the phone call 23 days ago. I have a forensic account of the wire transfers pulled from Ridgeline's incorporated filings in the state of West Virginia. I have county server logs showing waitlist modifications timestamped to within 48 hours of 6 separate development acquisition closings. And I have a list of 47 families displaced over 15 years, every one of them, in a corridor that was acquired for private development within 90 days of their correction." Stellan took one step closer. "So, yes, I have documentation." Douglas looked at him for a long time. His hands were flat on the desk now. The coffee had gone cold beside them. "I understand why you're angry," he said, and his voice had shifted again, softer now. Almost gentle, the register of a man pivoting to something he's used before and found effective. "Losing your housing in 2009 was genuinely terrible. Losing contact with your brother was worse. I have never stopped thinking about the cases that fell through the cracks during those years. The system was underfunded and understaffed, and I made decisions with the resources I had. Some of those decisions had consequences I regret deeply." Stellan said nothing. "But what you're describing, a coordinated scheme, financial arrangements, deliberate targeting, that's not what happened. You're drawing connections between coincidences and calling it a conspiracy." He leaned forward, hands open, palms up. "Sometimes families fall through the cracks, not because anyone intended them to, but because a system built with too little money and too little staff cannot serve everyone equally well. That's a tragedy, but it's not a crime." "The witness," Stellan said, "heard you say the Briggs file stays closed." A pause, not long, 1 second, maybe less. But it was there, and both of them knew it had been there. "A phone conversation overheard out of context," Douglas said, and the warmth was still in his voice, but something underneath it had changed timbre. "Is not evidence, it's hearsay. If someone claims they heard..." "He also heard 372,400, Stellan said. "Wire in thirds, same as Pinewood. He heard those specific numbers 23 days before I had ever mentioned them to him. He repeated them to me at 2 o'clock this morning without knowing what they meant. The silence this time was longer." Douglas looked at his desk. At the flat surface of it, the organized papers, the pen in its Holder, the framed photograph of his family at the beach on the South Carolina coast 2 summers ago. Even if that were true, he said quieter now, it wouldn't be enough to... The FBI has been building a case against you for 8 months, Stellan said. They've had a pattern, but not a thread. Wire fraud across state lines is federal. Corruption of a federally funded housing program is federal. And when you've been doing it for 15 years, connecting 14 verified transactions through a shell consulting account to development contracts you approved in your official capacity. He stopped. Let the silence do its work. That's RICO territory. That's not a county case. That's not a form letter. That's the rest of your life. Douglas Parrish said nothing. His breathing had changed. It was slightly faster now, slightly shallower, the metabolic signature of a body that has received information it cannot accommodate. He stood up, walked to the window, stood with his back to Stellan, looking at the parking lot below, at the 200 bikes, the 200 men, the woman in the borrowed jacket standing in the front row with her bandaged wrist and her spine straight. You don't understand what this job is like, he said. His voice was different now, quieter. Some of the architecture had come down. The housing program was failing before I touched it. Families waiting 2 years, 3 years with no funding and no staff and no solutions. The developers came to me with a way to clear the backlog, move some money through the system, accelerate acquisitions in the corridors that were stalling development, free up funds that could go back into the program for other families. He stopped. I made a choice, a hard choice, the kind that doesn't look clean in hindsight, but felt like the only option available at the time. You made $372,000 from that choice, Stellan said. How much did the families you moved make? Douglas turned from the window. His face had changed again, something younger in it now, something that looked almost plaintive. I have a daughter in college, $63,000 a year. My wife has MS. The treatments cost more than my salary. I have worked long weeks for 20 years in this county, trying to do right by people, and you know what that got me? Burnout and debt in a system that makes promises it will never have the funding to keep. His voice cracked slightly. I told myself I was helping more than I was hurting. I told myself the families I displaced were resilient, that they'd find other options, that I was moving resources to where they could do the most good. He looked at Stellan. I have grandchildren. If I go to prison, I'll never see them grow up. I am not a monster. I am a man who made terrible choices in an impossible situation. Stellan looked at him for a long time. Then he said very quietly, I'm not interested in your reasons. The sentence landed like something physical. Caleb Calloway is 15 years old, Stellan said. 3 weeks ago, you signed off on a correction that moved his family's waitlist position back 200 slots. His mother got sick during the eviction and ended up in county medical. He ended up on the street, 3 weeks sleeping in stairwells and parking structures, eating when he could, trying to stay invisible. His voice was still quiet, but the room felt smaller. 2 nights ago, he walked 6 miles through freezing rain without a jacket because he found a 2-year-old girl whose father had collapsed and he didn't know where else to take her. He paused. That girl was my daughter, and when that boy woke up this morning, he told me about a phone call he overheard in a parking garage. A call where you said my family's name. The file you've spent 15 years making sure stayed closed. Douglas was very pale. I'm not interested in your medical bills, Stellan continued. I'm not interested in your daughter's tuition or your wife's treatments or your years of public service. I am interested in the 47 families you displaced, the children who ended up in shelters, the parents who lost custody because they lost housing, the people whose files you closed without forwarding addresses and who have been missing from this county's records ever since. He straightened. In about 4 hours, the FBI is going to walk through that door and ask you those same questions. And they are going to be considerably less patient about the answers. He turned and walked toward the door. Wait, Douglas said. Stellan stopped. He didn't turn around. I was careful, Douglas said. For 15 years, I was so careful. It came out quiet and unguarded, the kind of thing that surfaces when all the strategies have failed and what's left is just the thing itself stripped of management. Not an appeal, not a defense, just the truth arriving without permission. Stellan stood in the doorway for one more moment, then he walked out. He came down the front steps and across the parking lot and stopped at the bottom of the steps where the 200 could see him. He looked at Hound, then at Ironside, who had driven through the night from Charleston with 6 brothers from the southern chapter, his heavy presence anchoring the back row the way it always did, steady, say, unspectacular load-bearing. Then at Ruth, still standing where he'd left her. "It's done," he said. "Hound," he admitted. "Close enough. The FBI call went in at 8. Agents are on their way." He looked at the news van across the street, the reporter with the camera, the building full of people who were about to learn what had been happening in their county for 15 years. "We stay," he said, "until he's in custody, until we know for certain this is real." Nobody argued. Between 9:47 and 11:30, 3 people walked into the county building, not as employees, but as something else. People who had seen the news clip, or who had recognized the gathering for what it was, or who had simply been carrying something for a long time and had finally found a room that looked like it was built for the weight of it. The first was Eleanor Wax, 71 years old, retired school nurse, 43 years on Canary Street, in the same house 3 blocks from where Ruth and Caleb had lived on Ironwood Hollow. She found Hound near the building entrance and said, "I need to tell someone what I saw." Hound led her to a quiet corner and opened the recorder app on his phone without making a production of it. She told him about seeing Caleb 3 times during the week of the eviction, sitting on the front steps, each time looking smaller. She had filed an inquiry with the school district, called twice. Nobody answered. She had told herself someone else would handle it, that she was overreacting, that family services would intervene. She had been wrong. Her hands were shaking by the time she finished. Hound told her, "What you just gave me is evidence." She looked at his card for a long time before she put it in her pocket. The second was Victor Pruitt, 56 years old, former county housing intake coordinator who had processed 11 waitlist corrections under Douglas Parrish's direction before resigning in 2021. He found Stellan in the parking lot and said without preamble, "I work for him." He told Stellan about the corrections, about the pattern he had noticed about the day Douglas brought him a file belonging to a single mother with stage 4 cancer who had been waiting 19 months. Victor had refused to sign it. Douglas had told him his job performance was under review, that budget cuts were coming, that he should consider whether he wanted to be seen as a team player. Victor had resigned 2 weeks later. Personal reasons. That's what he told everyone. "I've been ready for 3 years," he said. "I just didn't know who to tell." Stellan held his gaze for a moment. "You ready to say that on the record?" Victor said yes, without hesitating. At 11:34, a dark sedan pulled into the lot. Federal plates. 2 agents in plain clothes, a woman and a man, both in their mid-40s, with the particular exhaustion of people who have been working a case too long without sufficient traction. The woman's name was Della Cross. She was compact and direct, and she moved through the parking lot with the specific efficiency of someone who has learned not to waste motion. She found Stellan in the front row. "Stellan Briggs." "That's me." "Agent Cross, FBI Field Office, Charleston. I'm told you have something relevant to an open federal investigation." "Depends on what you're investigating." "Douglas Parrish, McDowell County Commissioner. Suspected housing assistance fraud and developer bribery. We've been building a case for 8 months. We haven't been able to move." Stellan looked at her. 8 months. "Yes. We got a boy off the street in 48 hours. The silence sat heavy between them. The man beside Cross, Agent Floyd Steer, said, "We have protocols." "So do we," Stellan said. "Ours move faster." Cross looked at him for a moment. She didn't argue because she was standing in a parking lot with 200 bikers in a federal case that hadn't moved in 8 months, and the man in front of her clearly had something she didn't. "What do you have?" she asked. Stellan pulled out his phone, opened a folder, handed it to her. She read. Her expression shifted, stopped, then continued, stopped again at one specific line and leaned forward almost imperceptibly. "This fills a gap we haven't been able to close," she said quietly. "Good, because there's more." Getch stepped forward with the laptop. 47 families cross-referenced with development acquisition dates. Estimated total fraud, 1.2 million over 15 years. Names, dates, dollar amounts. And in 9 cases, direct quotes from displaced families who had been told their corrections were procedural. Agent Steer scanned the data. He said something under his breath that was not for the record. "There's a prior case," Stellan said, 2009. "My younger brother, Derek Briggs, developmental disability, mild to moderate. When our family was displaced that year, he was placed in county developmental services. The facility closed in 2010. His file was marked closed in 2011. I have not been able to locate him since." He paused. "I believe Parrish was involved in the placement arrangement. Same pattern: administrative action during housing displacement, no follow-up contact file closed by a staff member who subsequently resigned." Cross looked up. "You have proof. Circumstantial. Timing matches. If you pull his case file from 2009, you'll see the same signature sequence." Cross handed the phone back to him. "We'll need to speak to the witness. His name is Caleb Calloway, 15 years old, 3 weeks on the street. He's safe staying with us. You want to speak to him, you do it with his consent and with someone he trusts present. Non-negotiable." Cross studied his face, then nodded. "Understood. One more thing." Stellan's voice was quiet and exact. "Caleb's mother, Ruth Calloway, is the most recent identified victim. She's here." He glanced toward Ruth. "She has something to say. I'd suggest you listen to it before you go upstairs." Ruth looked at Agent Cross directly. She'd been standing for 3 hours in the cold with a bandaged wrist and an elevated blood pressure, and she looked steadier than most people look sitting down. She told Cross what she'd told Noreen in the hospital room: the 14 months on the wait list, the letter, the 11 phone calls, the 3 in-person visits, the form letters, the legal aid office with no emergency pathway for people without permanent addresses, the eviction, the hospital, 3 weeks of not knowing where her son was sleeping. She told it the way she had always told things, without decoration, without appeal, with the specific precision of a woman who spent 17 years in clinical settings learning to make information count. When she finished, Cross was quiet for a moment. "Ms. Calloway," she said, "would you be willing to serve as a named complainant in the federal case?" "I've been trying to make a complaint to this county for 14 months, Ruth said. "So yes, I'll make one to you." At 12:08 in the afternoon, Douglas Parrish was escorted out of the McDowell County building in handcuffs. He was wearing the same charcoal wool coat he'd worn that morning. He was not crying or shouting. He walked between Cross and Steer, with his head down and his hands fastened behind him, and when he passed the parking lot, he looked up once, just once, and saw Stellan Briggs standing at the center of the front row. Beside Stellan, Ruth Calloway. Bandaged wrist, borrowed jacket, spine straight. Douglas looked away. He asked quietly as he was being guided into the federal sedan whether someone could call his neighbor about his mail, as if that were the thing that required managing, as if the logistics of the ordinary life he had conducted alongside this one needed to be kept in order. The door closed. The sedan pulled out of the lot. 200 engines started at once. The sound rolled across the hollow like thunder, answering itself, low and enormous and final, filling the valley between the buildings and the bare winter hills until it was the only thing in the world. Then in sequence, the rows began to move, and within 4 minutes, the parking lot was empty, and the sound was fading north and east and west, dispersing into the cold morning air of McDowell County like something that had done what it came to do. What they didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that Douglas's arrest was only the surface of it. At 2:47 in the afternoon, Stellan was back at the clubhouse. After returning Ruth to the hospital for the monitoring she still needed, she had gone without argument, which told him how exhausted she actually was. He had come back to find Caleb awake on the cot, sitting up eating crackers that Birch had left on the chair beside him. Gracie was on the floor with a set of wooden blocks, coffee on the table going cold. His phone buzzed. "Cross," he answered. "We opened the office safe," she said, no preamble. "What we found is going to complicate things." "How?" "The kind of complicated where one name leads to several more. Can you give me an hour?" He said yes. By 3:52, 12 brothers were in the back room. Stellan, Hound, Ratchet, Birch, Sketch, Ironside, and 6 others whose road names carried weight in 3 chapters. Ruth was not there. She was back in the hospital where she needed to be under monitoring resting. But she had asked Noreen to call her the moment anything significant developed. Cross arrived at 4:03, alone, no steer, no official capacity. She put a folder on the table. "This doesn't leave this room," she said, "until I have enough to move through official channels." She opened the folder. Inside printed emails, bank statements, in a handwritten ledger bound in black cloth, water-stained at the corners, dates going back to 2007. Douglas Parrish had kept records, not digital, paper, hidden behind a false electrical panel in the back wall of his office closet. He had documented everything. Every family displaced, every payment received, every person whose signature appeared anywhere near the transactions. A ledger of coverage maintained in case coverage was ever needed. He kept it as insurance, Cross said. If he was ever exposed, he wanted leverage, names to trade. Stellan was already scanning the pages, reading fast, his finger moving down lines of dates and amounts and initials. He stopped. March 17, 2009. He read the entry once, then again. Briggs S/South Welch Corridor $146,800 Ridgeline Development Partners /Placement D. Briggs County Developmental Services Facility 7. His vision narrowed to that line. There it was, black ink on yellowed paper. The day everything was taken, the dollar amount, the company name, the notation about Derek. Facility 7, a designation he had never encountered in 15 years of FOIA requests and legal appeals and quiet patient searching. "What is Facility 7?" he asked. His voice was flat and very quiet. Cross turned pages. "It appears 16 times in the ledger. Always connected to a displacement. Always a family member with a disability or special care need. Never a county-designated facility number." We didn't recognize it either. Sketch was already typing, checking county contracts from 2007 to 2012, cross-referencing Facility 7 with developmental services and private care providers. 30 seconds of silence. Then Sketch stopped. 2008, he said. County signed a 5-year contract with a private care organization, Appalachian Community Care Services. Contract covered residential support for up to 40 adults with developmental or cognitive disabilities. Facilities were designated internally as 1 through 8. "Where was Facility 7? Stellan asked. More typing. "Ironwood Hollow," Sketch said. His voice was careful. "Same corridor Parrish cleared for development in 2011. The room went very quiet. "Hound, let me guess. The facility closed before the development deal went through." 2010, Sketch said. "Contract terminated early. County cited budget constraints. 19 residents at time of closure." "Where did they go?" Stellan asked. Sketch read. His face changed. Files were transferred to independent living services. No forwarding addresses listed for 16 of the 19. Oversight transferred to a county social worker who... He stopped, scrolled. Who submitted her resignation 6 months later? Personal reasons. Stellan stood up. He walked to the window. 19 residents. His brother had been one of them. His brother's file said transferred to independent living. No address, no follow-up. just a closed file in a system that had moved on to the next thing. How many of the 16 have documented follow-up records, he asked. Silence. None, Sketch said. Stellan's hands found the windowsill and stayed there. 16 people, he said. 16 vulnerable adults with developmental disabilities. 16 families who had just been displaced and didn't have the stability to fight the system that had placed their relatives there in the first place. He stopped. 16 files closed without forwarding addresses. We don't know they're gone, Cross said carefully. We know the records are incomplete. Stellan turned around. Pull every file from that facility, he said. Track down every name. Find them, verify where they are, and when you can't account for the majority of them, tell me I'm wrong. Cross looked at him, then at the ledger, then back. Her face had the particular quality of a federal agent recalculating the scale of what she's looking at. If what you're suggesting is accurate, she said slowly, this isn't housing fraud anymore. This is exploitation of vulnerable adults. Potential conspiracy across multiple agencies and a private contractor. My brother, Stellan said, is one of 16 people who have been missing from county records for 15 years. While Douglas Parrish attended church picnics and drove a county SUV and collected a salary paid by the same county whose most vulnerable residents he was selling to private developers. Nobody spoke. Sketch turned his laptop around. On screen, a wire transfer record from 3 days before the night of the storm. Origin Ridgeline Development Partners, LLC, Destination Aldridge Consulting Group, amount $89,200. Reference final quarter acquisition, Ironwood Hollow. Ironwood Hollow. 2318 Ironwood Hollow. Ruth and Caleb's address. Douglas Parrish had been paid $89,000 to clear them out 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, while he was driving his county SUV and being photographed shaking hands at the Welch Chamber of Commerce dinner. The room was very quiet. Then Stellan looked at Ironside. I need help finding Derek, he said. I need help. I know it's been 15 years. Ironside stood slowly. He was 60 years old and had found things in those years that the official systems had given up looking for. He crossed the room and put one large hand on Stellan's shoulder. Then we start looking, he said, tonight. Stellan looked around the room at Hound and Ratchet and Birch and Sketch and the brothers who had driven through the night because he had asked. Pound on, he said, find a social worker who resigned. Her name should be in the facility contract documents. Track her down. She knows what happened when that facility closed. Hound nodded. Sketch, every county record you can access on Facility 7 in Appalachian Community Care Services. Resident names, transfer dates, any documentation of follow-up care. On it. Ratchet and Birch, start calling the 47 families on the list. Find out who saw what. Find out who tried to report something and was ignored. They nodded. That night, after Cross had gone and most of the brothers had driven home, and the clubhouse had thinned to a quiet few, Stellan sat at the table with Derek's file in front of him. The FOI IA copy, the one that had come back twice with the placement destination and the signing official redacted in thick black bars. He looked at the photograph clipped to the inside cover. Derek at 19, smiling, holding a drawing he'd made in a house and a tree, the house perfectly square, the tree a circle on a stick, the way trees look when someone draws them from the inside of how a tree feels rather than how it looks. Stellan had this same drawing tattooed on his forearm 18 years ago. He could feel it under his sleeve. I'm coming, he said, not loud, not performing, just true. His phone buzzed. Cross FBI formal investigation opened. RICO filing initiated. Parrish arraigned tomorrow 9 a.m. Bail hearing immediately after. You should be there. He typed back, I'll be there. This isn't over until we find the 16. Her response arrived fast. Agreed. Working it tonight. He set the phone down. He looked at Caleb, still on the cot, asleep again, the frostbitten hand resting on his chest, the boy's face peaceful in the way faces are peaceful when the body has finally been given permission to let go. That boy had walked 6 miles in a storm to bring Gracie home. He had carried a set of numbers in his memory for 23 nights without knowing what they were for, and then he had handed them over the moment he understood that someone in the room could use them. He had done all of it with nothing. No resources, no safety net, no reason to believe anyone would help, because his mother had told him to find someone real. Stellan turned off the overhead light, left the lamp on low. Outside, McDowell County was quiet and cold and covered in the previous night's snow, and somewhere in it, in some office building or some courthouse or some federal database, the shape of what Douglas Parrish had built for 15 years was beginning document by document to come apart. It was not over, but it had started. The day after the arraignment, Ruth Calloway made her first phone call. She had been discharged properly. This time blood pressure in an acceptable range. Doctors satisfied, if not entirely pleased, a follow-up appointment scheduled for the following week. She was sitting in the back room of the clubhouse with a notebook Noreen had brought her and a cup of coffee that Ratchet had left on the table without being asked. She had 2 notebooks now, one for Cross, one for herself. The one for Cross would hold the documented testimony, the names and dates and specifics that attorneys could use. The one for herself would hold what the forms couldn't. She dialed the first number on the list Sketch had printed. 47 names, 47 addresses, 47 families who had received a letter with Douglas Parrish's signature at the bottom and had nowhere left to go after that. The woman who answered was named Bertie Oakes, 61 years old, lived in a cousin's basement in Logan County, now had been on the McDowell wait list for 19 months before the correction came. Ruth introduced herself, said her name and her situation without preamble or performance, said she had received the same letter, and she was calling because someone needed to listen to what had happened, and she was that someone. Bertie Oakes was quiet for a moment, then she talked for 47 minutes. Ruth wrote everything down with her right hand, the notebook balanced on her knee, her bandaged left wrist resting on the table. She did not interrupt. She did not redirect. She asked 3 questions in 47 minutes, and all 3 were the kind that opened doors rather than closed them. When the call ended, she sat for a moment looking at what she'd written. Then she dialed the second number. She made 6 calls that day, 8 the next. By the end of the first week, she had spoken to 23 families. By the end of the second week, 38. The remaining 9 she reached in the third week, some through other families who passed her number along, some through the network of churches and community organizations that existed in the hollows and hillside neighborhoods of McDowell County as the actual connective tissue of a community that official systems had never fully served. She also called 4 additional families that Bertie Oakes had mentioned, people who had never filed formal complaints because they hadn't believed there was a point whose names weren't on the original list, but whose stories followed the same pattern. For the purposes of the civil case, the documented count held at 47, but Ruth kept those 4 names in her second notebook because their stories were real, regardless of whether they appeared in a filing. She talked to a retired coal miner in his 70s who had lost his waitlist position 2 weeks before his daughter's wedding and had spent the night of the reception sleeping in his truck. She talked to a woman with 3 children under 10 who had been told her correction was procedural and had believed it because she had no reason not to and no resources to investigate it. She talked to a man who had lost his apartment, then his sobriety, and who said on the phone quietly and without self-pity that he had always known something wasn't right, but hadn't known who to tell. I just didn't know who to tell. She heard that sentence or a version of it in almost every conversation. People who had seen signs and filed inquiries that went unanswered like Eleanor Wax. People who had suspected the timing wasn't coincidence, but had no mechanism to act on that suspicion. People who had simply been told no in enough different ways that they had stopped asking. She was good at these conversations in the way that some people are good at things they didn't choose to learn. 17 years in clinical settings had given her the capacity to sit with difficult information without making the person delivering it feel judged for having lived it. She knew how to be present without performing presence. She knew how to let a silence be a door rather than a wall. Agent Cross had given Ruth a formal designation, cooperating witness, supporting the civil case being built alongside the criminal prosecution. But the conversations Ruth was having weren't structured like witness interviews. They were something older than that. They were the kind of conversations that happen when someone who has been through a thing sits down with someone else who has been through the same thing, and both of them know that the other one knows, and nothing has to be explained from the beginning. Her second notebook held what no legal filing would capture: Gerald Pickett's sobriety, which had not survived the eviction in its aftermath. Donna Reeves, the county social worker, who had been directed to close the facility, 7 files, and had done so under institutional pressure, and had carried the weight of that compliance ever since a woman who was both witness to wrongdoing and someone whose professional life had been shaped by being forced to participate in it. The 3 parents who had lost custody not because they were unfit, but because losing housing had triggered welfare assessments they couldn't contest from a shelter. Ruth listed these not as accusations, but as an accounting, a plain language record of what the system owed. 3 days after the arraignment, Ratchet drove Caleb to McDowell County General for his follow-up appointment. Same hospital, same entrance, where Caleb had found Gracie standing alone in the fluorescent light while her father went down. Different reason for being there. This time someone had made the appointment, driven him there, and was sitting in the waiting room pretending to read a magazine he'd already read twice. The doctor was a woman in her late 50s with the efficient, unhurried manner of someone who has been doing this a long time and has decided that kindness and competence are not in competition with each other. She unwrapped the bandaging on Caleb's left hand, carefully studied each finger, pressed along the joints, asked him to make a fist, and then spread his fingers wide. Full range of motion, no tissue death, no nerve damage. "You got very lucky," she said. "Ratchet got me warm fast enough," Caleb said. She looked through the doorway at the waiting room. "He did excellent work," she said, "but you're the one who walked 6 miles in those conditions." She paused. "That took something most people don't have." Caleb looked at the floor. "I just walked." She wrapped his hand in lighter bandaging, gave him care instructions, told him to come back in 2 weeks. Then she said, "I heard what you did for the little girl." Quietly, without ceremony. "Because of you, she still has her father. I want you to know that matters." Caleb didn't answer. His throat was doing something he hadn't planned for. He went back to the waiting room. Ratchet stood up, immediately closed. The magazine looked at Caleb's face with the practiced attention of someone trained to read physical and emotional states with equal accuracy. "You hungry?" he asked. "Yeah." "Good, because Birch made chili, and if we don't get back before Sketch finds it, we'll be eating crackers." That evening, the table at the clubhouse was set. 8 brothers. Gracie in a high chair next to Stellan. Caleb's spot already waiting. Nobody had said anything about it. It had just been left. Caleb took a bowl, filled it, sat down. For the first time in 3 weeks, he ate without watching the door, without calculating how fast he'd need to move if something changed, without the low-grade timer in his head, counting down to when the meal would end and the next problem would begin. He just ate. Halfway through the second bowl, his shoulders dropped. The tension that had been living there since the eviction let go in one slow, involuntary release, and he didn't try to get it back. Ratchet saw it happen, caught Stellan's eye across the table, and nodded once. Stellan looked at Caleb for a moment, then went back to his food without saying anything about it, because some things are better received in silence. On the 6th day, Noreen drove Ruth out to the house on Maple Street. It was a small house, 2 bedrooms, a front porch that needed repainting, a yard with a fence that enclosed a specific amount of space rather than keeping anything in or out, and a kitchen window that looked out on the bare winter yard with the particular domestic honesty of a window that has been looked through for years and keeps no secrets about the light. Noreen had cleaned it, put clean sheets on both beds, left a bag of groceries on the counter. Ruth stood in the doorway of the smaller bedroom. A bed, a desk, a window, the simplest version of what a room for a person should contain. She stood there for a while. Then she went back to the kitchen and called Stellan's number. He answered on the second ring. "He's doing well," Stellan said before she could ask. "Hand is healing. He ate 2 bowls of chili last night, and Birch said his shoulders dropped halfway through the second one." Ruth closed her eyes for a moment. "Bring him home," she said. Stellan pulled up to the Maple Street house that afternoon with Caleb in the passenger seat of his truck. Caleb looked at the house through the windshield, at the fence and the porch and the kitchen window, and the particular quality of light that comes from inside an occupied space on a winter afternoon. He got out of the truck. Noreen was on the porch. She had been waiting without trying to look like she was waiting, which is its own particular skill. When Caleb came up the porch steps, she came down them to meet him, and she held him for 15 seconds with the specific force of someone who has spent 19 days not knowing where he was and is compensating for every one of those days in a single held moment. When she let go, her eyes were wet and she didn't apologize for it. "Your mother's inside," she said. "She's been up since 5, making sure the room was right." Caleb looked at the front door. Then he went inside. Ruth was in the kitchen. She turned when she heard him come in. They stood in the kitchen of the small house on Maple Street and looked at each other. And there was no version of this moment that required words because everything that needed saying was already contained in the fact of them both being there upright together on the other side of it. She put her good arm around him. He put his face against her shoulder the way he hadn't done since he was small, and they stood there in the kitchen while the light moved in the window over the bare winter yard. After a while, she said, "Your room is the one on the left." He went to look at it. He stood in the doorway for a long time. "Is this really ours?" he asked. "For as long as we need it," she said. Stellan had stayed by the truck during all of this. When Caleb went inside, he stood in the driveway with his hands in his pockets and looked at the house for a moment. Then Ruth came back to the door. She looked at him from the porch. The afternoon light was behind her. "Thank you," she said. "Your son saved my daughter's life," Stellan said. "We're making sure he has somewhere to come back to. That's not charity. That's a debt getting paid." Ruth was quiet for a moment, then the 47 families. "I've spoken to all of them now, plus 4 more that weren't on the original list. The 3 who lost custody, I want to make sure they're specifically named in the civil case with separate documentation. The housing displacement triggered the welfare assessments that led to the removals. That chain needs to be traceable in court." Stellan looked at her. "I'll tell Cross," he said. Ruth nodded once. She went back inside. Stellan stood in the driveway a moment longer. Then he got in his truck and drove back toward Coalfield Road, and the house on Maple Street was small and lit in the rearview mirror. And then it wasn't visible at all. The brothers came to say goodbye to Caleb 2 days later. Not goodbye as in permanently, goodbye as in you have somewhere to be now and we have somewhere to be. And the distance between those 2 places is not the same as absence. Birch came first. He crouched down on the porch so he was at Caleb's level. The posture he'd maintained for years with students in his office, the posture of a man who had learned that talking down to young people was the fastest way to stop them from talking at all. "You settling in?" he asked. "Yeah," Caleb said. "Good, yeah." Birch pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket, a phone number written in neat, careful print. "That's my number. Anything school bad nights, whatever comes up. I spent 10 years with kids your age. I know what it looks like when the ground stops being solid. You don't have to go through that alone anymore." He pressed the paper into Caleb's hand. "I mean it. Anytime." He straightened up. Ruffled Caleb's hair once the way you touch something you want to handle with care. Then he got in his truck and drove. Sketch arrived an hour later, younger, faster, with the slightly compressed energy of someone who communicates better through action than conversation. He handed Caleb a laptop. "Refurbished, but solid," he said. Good enough for school and then some. There's a folder on the desktop, your story, everything in the case that's a matter of public record. Every document that explains what happened to your family and why. You're old enough to know. If you want to read it, it's there. If you don't delete it, that's your call. He pulled out his phone, showed Caleb his contact. I'm good with systems. Computers, records, tracking things down. You ever need help finding something, anything, you text me. Caleb took the laptop carefully. Why are you giving me this? Sketch looked at him directly. Because Parrish took a lot from you. He doesn't get to take the story too. You know what happened. You get to decide what you do with it. He knocked his fist gently against Caleb's shoulder. Not hard. The contact of someone who means well and isn't sure how to say it any other way. Then he left. Ratchet came last. He brought a first aid kit, a real one packed with exactly the supplies that someone recovering from frostbite in a cold climate needed for the next month, and a handwritten card with care instructions for the hand. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets, looking mildly uncomfortable in the way people look when they have something important to say and are not sure of the architecture of saying it. The hand looks good, he said. Keep it warm. Any numbness or pain that's new or getting worse, call me immediately. Before you call anyone else. Clear, Caleb said. Ratchet nodded. Then, I've seen a lot of situations. 2 tours, 6 years as an EMT, 12 years riding with this chapter. Things that should have ended badly and didn't. You know what the difference usually is? Caleb shook his head. Someone shows up, Ratchet said, at the right moment and decides to stay. He pulled a card from his pocket, Stellan's number, Hound's number, his own. You showed up for Gracie when it mattered. We showed up for you. That's the whole thing. That's how this works. He handed over the card. You're family now, not in a formal way, but the real way. And family means you call. Caleb took the card, looked at it. It does, he said, mean something. Ratchet nodded once satisfied with that and walked to his bike. Stellan came last of all. He pulled up to the Maple Street house and got out of the truck and stood at the end of the front walk, while Caleb came down the porch steps. They stood in the weak winter sunlight, Caleb with his laptop under his arm and 3 phone numbers in his jacket pocket. Stellan held out his hand. Caleb took it and Stellan shook it firm and level, the handshake of someone who considers the other person an equal, regardless of the difference in their years or their circumstances. You call if you need anything, Stellan said. Day or night, you hear me? I hear you. You've got family now, blood and chosen both. He paused. Don't forget either one. He got back in his truck, started the engine, rolled down the window. Caleb, the boy looked up. You did good, Stellan said. Real good. Don't let what happened make you think otherwise. Then he pulled out of the driveway and drove north on Maple Street, and the truck was gone around the corner. Before Caleb had fully processed that he was standing in front of a house that was his, with a room that was his, and 3 phone numbers in his pocket and a laptop under his arm, and the first solid ground he'd felt in 3 weeks beneath his feet. He went inside. His mother was at the kitchen table with her second notebook open. She looked up when he came in. Ratchet said the hand is good, Caleb said. I know, he texted me. Caleb sat down across from her, looked at the notebook, at the columns of names and dates and losses that she'd been building one phone call at a time. You're going to be okay, he said. She looked at him. We're going to be okay, she said. And she meant it the way she had always meant things, not as reassurance, not as performance, but as an accurate assessment of conditions based on available evidence. 9 months after the night of the storm, the federal trial of Douglas Parrish began in the United States District Court for the Southern District of West Virginia. It lasted 9 months. The prosecution presented wire transfer records, county, server logs, the ledger from the false panel in the office closet, the testimony of Victor Pruitt, the testimony of Donna Reeves, who had carried the weight of what she'd done at Facility 7 for 15 years, and who, When Hound finally reached her by phone, had cried for 6 minutes before she could speak, and then had talked for 2 hours without stopping, naming names and dates and the specific texture of what it had felt like to be told that closing those files was not her concern. She had been pressured into compliance by institutional authority and had lived with that compliance ever since. She was both a witness to wrongdoing and someone whose professional had been shaped by being coerced into participating in it, not absolved by that coercion, but honest about it, in a way that the prosecution found both credible and damning. The prosecution presented testimony from 11 of the 47 families. They presented financial analysis showing a 15-year pattern of displacement correlated with development acquisition timelines in 14 separate quarters across McDowell County. During the investigation, 6 of the 16 facility's 7 residents were found in group homes and residential facilities in Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio, placed there after Appalachian Community Care Services closed without adequate handoff documentation. 6 found, 10 still unaccounted for. Derek Briggs was not among the 6. Douglas Parrish was convicted on all 14 counts: wire fraud, bribery, corruption of public office, conspiracy, and 10 counts of exploitation of vulnerable adults. 18 months after the night of the storm, Ruth and Caleb Calloway sat in the McDowell County Federal Courthouse in Welch, West Virginia, waiting for the sentencing hearing to begin. Caleb was 16 now. He was wearing a button-down shirt that Noreen had helped him choose, and shoes that were slightly uncomfortable in the way dress shoes are always slightly uncomfortable when you don't wear them enough. He had a folder on his lap containing a statement he had written and rewritten 6 times. The 6th version was shorter than the first by about 200 words and more accurate, and he'd stopped revising when he realized that he'd taken out all the words he put in to fill space, and what was left was the thing itself. Beside him, Noreen, Ratchet, Birch, and Ruth, who was wearing her navy blazer and sitting with the stillness of someone who has been preparing for something long enough that the preparation has become the thing itself. Douglas Parrish was at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, thinner than he'd been at arraignment, older looking, in the way people look when they've spent months inside a process that strips away the management layer they've maintained for years. He didn't look at the gallery when they came in. The bailiff called Ruth's name first. She walked to the podium, set down her second notebook, the plain language one, the accounting of what had actually been lost. She looked at the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "my name is Ruth Calloway. I was a registered nurse in this county for 17 years. I spent 14 months on the McDowell County Housing Assistance wait list before receiving a letter telling me my position had been corrected. 2 weeks before my number was scheduled to come up." Her voice was level. This was her clinical voice, not flat, not affectless, but controlled in the way that a scalpel is controlled, precise and clean. "I made 11 phone calls. I visited the county office 3 times. I wrote letters. My pastor wrote a letter. I was told in various ways and by various people that the system was working on it, that there were processes, that there was nothing further that could be done at the county level." She opened the second notebook. "I'm here to tell you what he took. Not in legal terms, you have attorneys for that, but in terms of what actually left these families' lives and did not come back. He took Bertie Oakes' ability to attend her grandchildren's birthdays from a home rather than a borrowed couch. He took Marcus and Laverne Hutter's custody of their youngest daughter because losing their housing triggered a welfare assessment that they did not have the resources to contest from a shelter. He took Gerald Pickett's sobriety. He took the professional life of a county social worker who was pressured into closing files she knew should not be closed and who has lived with that knowledge for 15 years. He took the belief from dozens of families in this county that someone in this system actually gives a damn about people like us." She turned another page. "And he took 16 people from facility, 16 adults with developmental disabilities whose families had just been destabilized by the same system that then placed them in a private care facility and closed their files when it was convenient to do so. 6 of those 16 people have been found. 10 have not. She closed the notebook. He did all of this, she said, while shaking hands at community dinners and building houses for Habitat for Humanity and collecting a salary paid by the same county whose most vulnerable residents he was selling to private developers. He did it for 15 years. And the system designed to catch exactly this kind of harm looked the other way for 15 years because the people being harmed were people the system had already decided were easy to overlook. She looked at the judge directly. He didn't just steal housing slots, she said. He stole the belief that someone in this system actually gives a damn about people like us. That belief is hard to rebuild. I'm still rebuilding it. Most of the families I spoke to are still rebuilding it. I hope the sentence today reflects not just what he did, but what it cost to undo it. Because the undoing takes longer than the doing. It always does. She picked up her notebook and walked back to her seat. The courtroom was very quiet. Caleb was called next. He stood up, walked to the podium, set his folder down and looked at it for a moment, then decided he didn't need it. "Your Honor," he said, "my name is Caleb Calloway. I'm 16 years old. 17 months ago, Douglas Parrish signed off on an administrative correction that moved my family's waitlist position back 200 slots. We lost our apartment. My mother got sick and ended up in the hospital. I ended up on the street." His voice was steady. He had practiced it until the steadiness was real rather than performed. "I slept in parking structures and stairwells. I went hungry. I got hurt. I learned what it feels like to be invisible, to ask for help and be told no, to watch people look at me and decide I wasn't worth their time." He paused. "I'm not here to tell you what sentence he deserves. That's not my job. I'm here to tell you what he took." He looked at his folder, then back at the judge. "He took my home. He took my mother's health. He took my belief that the system was designed to help people like me." He stopped, then continued quieter. "But he didn't take everything, because one night I found a little girl whose father had collapsed, and I walked 6 miles through a storm because she kept saying Daddy's angels, and I didn't know what else to do. And that walk led me to people who prove that sometimes the system fails, but people don't." He looked at Stellan in the gallery. Stellan nodded once. "My mom fought this system alone for 14 months. Then a 2-year-old girl said 3 words in a storm and everything changed." He picked up his folder, stepped back from the podium. "I hope you give him the maximum sentence. Not because I'm angry, though I am, but because there are 10 people still missing, and every year he spends in prison is a year the FBI has to find them and make sure this never happens again." He walked back to his seat. Noreen's hand found his and squeezed once. The judge looked at Douglas Parrish. Parrish stood slowly. He looked thinner and older and, for the first time, genuinely diminished. "Your Honor," he said, "I accept full responsibility for my actions. I caused serious harm to people who trusted this county to protect them. I am deeply sorry." The words were correct. They had the right shape, but they landed the way words land when the person saying them has run out of alternatives and everyone in the room could hear the difference. The judge looked at him for a long time. "Douglas Parrish," she said, "you held a position of public trust in this county for 23 years. You were given authority over a system designed to protect the most vulnerable members of this community. You used that authority systematically and deliberately to enrich yourself at the direct expense of the people you were mandated to serve." She looked down at her notes. "On count 1 wire fraud, 14 years. On count 2 bribery, 11 years. On counts 3 through 12, exploitation of vulnerable adults, 6 years each, to run consecutively. Total sentence, 85 years in federal prison. Parole eligibility after 51 years. Douglas Parrish's face went white. "You are further ordered to pay full restitution to all identified victims, the amount to be determined by the civil proceeding currently before this court. Your assets will be liquidated to satisfy this obligation. You will cooperate fully with ongoing federal investigations into the whereabouts of the 10 individuals still unaccounted for from Facility 7 records. She looked at Ruth, then at Caleb. The court recognizes the testimony offered today on behalf of the affected families. Your courage in coming forward was instrumental in this conviction. The gavel came down. Outside the courthouse, Caleb stood on the steps and breathed. Stellan stood beside him, not saying anything, just there. After a while, Caleb said, 85 years. Yes. He'll die in prison. Yes. A pause. The winter sun was pale and cold on the courthouse steps, and the bare trees along the street were black against the sky. Good, Caleb said. Stellan almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Ruth came out through the courthouse doors, Noreen behind her. She stopped beside Caleb and looked at the street and the pale sky and the bare trees. Come on, Stellan said. Let's go home. 7 years after the night of the storm, Caleb Calloway walked into the McDowell County Housing Assistance Office at 8:45 on a Monday morning, hung his jacket on the hook behind the door, and sat down at the intake coordinator's desk. He was 22 years old. He had a Bachelor of Social Work from West Virginia University completed in 3.5 years by taking summers and going full-time from the day he enrolled. His final year placement supervisor had written in his evaluation that he had a particular gift for sitting with families in crisis without making them feel assessed. He understood what that meant. He had been assessed. He knew the difference. The desk he was sitting at was as far as he could determine the same desk, same approximate position, in the same room where a caseworker had looked at her screen instead of his face when he'd come in at 15 with his mother's corrected wait list notice and asked what could be done. He had thought about this before he took the go, had sat with it for several days, had decided that the answer to a broken thing was not to walk away from it, but to go back in and fix it, and that the best person to fix a thing was someone who knew exactly how it broke. His first client arrived at 9:15, a woman named Loretta Hollenbeck, 36 years old, 2 children under 8, an eviction notice dated 11 days ago. She came in with the specific posture of someone who has already been told no too many times to enter a room without bracing for it, shoulders up, chin slightly down, eyes doing the quick involuntary assessment of exits. Caleb recognized the posture. He had worn it himself. He stood up when she came in, extended his hand. Ms. Hollenbeck, he said, I'm Caleb. I'm your intake coordinator. Sit down, please. She sat. She looked at him the way people look at someone younger than they expected, calculating whether the youth meant inexperience or dismissal. There's paperwork, he said. We'll go through it together and I'll explain what each part means in plain language. The system has been reformed, new oversight, new protocols, new accountability structure that went into effect 2 years ago. It's still not fast. I want to be honest with you about that, but it's not what it was. He leaned forward slightly. And I'm going to make sure your family is placed as quickly as the current system allows. I'm going to be the person you can call if something changes or you have a question, and I'm going to answer the call. Loretta Hollenbeck looked at him. You're serious, she said. Yes, ma'am. Her eyes filled. She pressed her lips together and looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked back up. Okay, she said. Okay, let's do the paperwork. 4 floors above the intake office in a corner room with 2 windows that looked out over the town of Welch and the ridgeline beyond it, Ruth Calloway sat at her desk as director of the McDowell County Housing Advocacy Program. The program had not existed 7 years ago. It had been created as part of the reform package following the Parrish conviction, built from a template that Ruth had drafted during the months she'd spent calling families with a bandaged wrist in a second notebook in which she had submitted to the County Oversight Board the day she was formally released from her cooperating witness obligations. The board had sat on it for 8 months. Then Agent Delacrosse had sent a letter recommending its adoption. Then Stellan Briggs had appeared at a county board meeting with 12 brothers and sat in the public gallery for 4 hours without saying a word. The board had voted to adopt the program the following Tuesday. Ruth had been its director for 4 years. She had a staff of 6. She had a hotline answered by a human being during business hours and by a recorded message with emergency referrals after hours. She had a formal partnership with the legal aid organization that had told her 7 years ago that they couldn't open an emergency file without a permanent address. That policy had changed. She had made sure of it. She was reading a case file now, one of 10 on her desk this week, each one a family in some stage of the displacement and recovery process that she had come to know as intimately as any clinical protocol she'd ever memorized. She read carefully, looking for the thing that wasn't written down, the detail that the form couldn't hold the human shape behind the data. Her left wrist ached in cold weather. It always would. She had learned to work with it rather than around it. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," she said. The door opened and Caleb leaned in. He was holding a file folder and wearing the slightly tired look of someone who has done real work for 8 consecutive hours and is satisfied with it. "First day's done," he said. Ruth looked at him, at the file in his hand, and the tiredness in his face, and the particular quality of steadiness that had been there since he was small, and that she had always known, even in the worst weeks, was not going to break. "How was it?" she said. "Hard," he said honestly. "Saw a lot of families that look like us." "That's going to happen every day." "I know," he paused. "I helped them though, or started to." "That's enough for day one," she said. "That's exactly enough." He nodded, started to pull the door closed, then stopped. "Stellan's at the Clubhouse tonight," he said. "Gracie has something to show us. Something about school." Ruth looked at the file in her hand, then she set it on top of the others and reached for her jacket. The Clubhouse on Coalfield Road smelled the same as it had the night Caleb had collapsed through its door 7 years ago. Motor oil and coffee and wood heat and the specific warm density of an occupied space that has held many people over many years. Some smells are structural. They don't leave. Stellan was at the table. Grayer now at the temples, a new line or two in the scar along his jaw, but otherwise substantially the same controlled presence, the same quality of attention, the kind of man who becomes more himself as he gets older rather than less. Gracie was doing homework at the far end of the table. She was 9 years old with her father's dark eyes and her own entirely specific way of moving through a room certain and unhurried, as if she had decided long ago where she was going and was simply following the route. She looked up when Ruth and Caleb came in. "Caleb," she said, "I got an A on my science project. The one about weather systems." "That's excellent, Gracie," Caleb said. She beamed at him with the pure, uncomplicated pleasure of a child who has done something well and has found exactly the right audience for it. Then she went back to her homework. Ruth and Caleb sat down. Ratchet appeared from the small kitchen with coffee for Ruth and a glass of water for Caleb without being asked. Stellan looked at Caleb. "How was the first day?" "Hard, Ruth said before Caleb could answer. "He already told me." Stellan looked at her. "He tell you what he did?" "Started to help the families," she said. "That's all that needs saying." Stellan nodded. Caleb looked at the far wall. The birthday card was there. In a frame that Stellan had made himself from scrap wood, the card centered and visible behind glass. The ink still running in blue rivers across the ruined cardboard, the words still legible, "Daddy's Angels." Gracie's handwriting at 2 years old, unsteady and completely certain. Beside it in a separate frame, a photograph. A girl 4 years old in a yellow dress, squinting slightly into the sun. Addie Briggs, never found. FBI still looking. And beside that a drawing, a house and a tree, the house perfectly square, the tree a circle on a stick. Reproduced from a photograph because the original was somewhere Stellan didn't know yet. Derek's drawing made it 19 copied and framed because the original deserved a frame even if it wasn't here. Caleb looked at the 3 frames for a long time. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the 3 cards. Birch's number, Sketch's number, Ratchet's number, worn soft at the edges. Now the writing faded from 7 years of being carried. He put them on the table in front of him. Stellan looked at the cards. "You still carry those," he said. "Yeah," Caleb said. Neither of them said anything else about it because nothing else needed to be said about it. "They found another one last week," Stellan said after a moment. "One of the 10, a man named Gerald Park. He's been in a residential facility in Morgantown since 2012. His file was misfiled under an incorrect county designation. He's 61 years old and in good health." "9 still missing," Caleb said. "9, Stellan said. "We keep looking. Ironside has been running down leads in the Ohio records. He thinks there might be 2 more in the Columbus area." Ruth looked at the frames on the wall, at Addie and the drawing and the birthday card with its running ink, at the particular weight of the things that had not been found yet and might never be sitting alongside the things that had been found and that were here in this room alive and present in the specific warmth of a Tuesday evening. Gracie finished a page of her homework, flipped to the next page, frowned briefly at a question, wrote something down. She had her father's quality of concentration complete and unhurried, undivided. The refrigerator hummed in the corner. The same refrigerator that had hummed 7 years ago when Birch pulled the birthday card from the vest pocket and the room went quiet and every person in it straightened without moving. The same sound in the same corner. And now the sound meant something different. It meant home. Not the beginning of one. Home itself. Ruth set down her coffee cup and looked at the birthday card. Daddy's Angels, written in the shaky, certain hand of a 2-year-old girl who had known something that night that none of the adults around her had known, who had pointed at a lit window in a storm and named what was inside it with a precision that turned out to be exact. Ruth had spent 7 years thinking about what it meant that a child had been right when all the systems designed to help had been wrong. She had not arrived at a satisfying theoretical answer, but she had arrived at a practical one. You pay attention. You listen when something feels wrong. You do not look away. You pick up the child and you walk. That was the whole of it. That was the only thing it had ever been. Stellan's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it. An unknown number, area code 503, Portland, Oregon. He picked it up and answered. "Mr. Briggs." A woman's voice, careful, professional, with something underneath the professionalism that wasn't quite neutral, the voice of a person who has been waiting to make a specific call for a long time and is now making it. "My name is Greta Hollis. I'm a social worker with Multnomah County in Oregon." Stellan went very still. Ruth looked at him. She saw his face change, not dramatically, not with any visible collapse of composure, but in the specific way that faces change when something arrives that has been waited for so long that the waiting has become its own kind of landscape and the arrival is almost disorienting. She reached over and put her hand over his on the table. He looked at her hand, then back at the phone. "I believe I found your brother Derek," Greta Hollis said. The refrigerator hummed. Gracie wrote something in her notebook without looking up. Caleb sat very still. "He's safe," Greta Hollis continued. "He's been in a residential care facility here in Portland since 2011. He was transferred there when Appalachian Community Care Services closed, but the transfer documentation was misfiled under a variant spelling of his last name and was never linked back to your family's records or to the McDowell County case." A pause. "He's in good health. He's been well cared for. He participates in the facility's art program. He makes drawings mostly, houses and trees." Stellan closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them. "He talks about you," Greta Hollis said gently. "The staff say he has for years. He says his brother is looking for him. He says he knows his brother will come because his brother always comes." "Can I talk to him?" Stellan asked. His voice was even. It cost him something to keep it even. "That's why I'm calling," she said. "He's right here. He's been waiting since I told him this morning." There was a sound, a brief exchange of voices that Stellan couldn't quite hear, and then the phone rustled, and then a voice came on the line that was familiar, the way a song is familiar when you haven't heard it in a very long time. Older, deeper than he remembered, but underneath all of it, exactly the same as it had always been. Stellan, he stood up, not because he decided to. He was simply standing, and then he was walking toward the door, and then he was outside in the cold February air of Coalfield Road. And the stars above the West Virginia ridgeline were the same stars they had always been, and he held the phone against his ear and he said, "Derek, I knew you'd find me." The voice was calm, happy in the uncomplicated way of someone who has held a belief for a long time and has been proven right. "I kept telling everyone, my brother is looking. He'll find me. He always comes." "I'm sorry it took so long," Stellan said. "You found me," Derek said. "That's what matters. That's the whole thing." They talked for 37 minutes. About nothing. About everything. About the years between and the years ahead, and the drawing that Stellan had tattooed on his forearm 18 years ago, and that Derek still made every week in the facility's art room, a house perfectly square and a tree perfectly round, and the specific satisfaction of putting the same thing on paper again and knowing it was right. About the facility in Portland and whether Derek liked it, which he did. He had friends there, he had his art, he had a window that looked out on a courtyard with a real tree. About the possibility of visits. About Gracie, who Derek had never met, who was 9 years old and had gotten an A on her weather systems project, and who had known at 2 years old exactly where the angels lived. When the call ended, Stellan stood outside with his back against the wall of the clubhouse looking at the stars. He was not crying in the way that grief produces. He was crying in the way that relief produces a physical response to the release of a pressure that has been present for so long that you've stopped being consciously aware of it and only recognize it when it lifts. The way you recognize how cold you have been the moment you come indoors. Inside the clubhouse, Ruth had not moved from her chair. She had heard his voice through the door, not the words, just the quality of it, the shift in register that happens when something fundamental changes in a person's understanding of where they are. She had heard it, and she had stayed where she was because some things need to happen without witnesses, and some kinds of relief need to be private before they can be shared. Gracie looked up from her homework. "Is Stellan okay?" she asked. "Yes," Ruth said. "Is he sad?" Ruth looked at the door. "No," she said, "he's not sad." Gracie considered this. Then she went back to her homework. Caleb was looking at the 3 frames on the wall, at Addie still unfound, at Derek's drawing waiting for its original, at the birthday card with its running ink, Daddy's Angels. He thought about the night he'd stood at the door with Gracie in his arms and knocked. He thought about the ceiling when he'd opened his eyes and the low amber light and the voice that said, "There you are, stay with me." He thought about his mother's face in the hospital corridor through the closing elevator doors. Watching him, still watching, even as the doors closed all the way. Find someone real. He had found them, or they had found each other, which was closer to the truth. The door opened and Stellan came back inside. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and his face had the look of someone who has set down something very heavy and is still feeling the absence of the weight, still orienting to the lightness, still learning the shape of a world in which the thing being carried is no longer being carried. He looked at Ruth, he looked at Caleb, then he looked at Gracie. She looked back at him with her father's dark, steady eyes. "Daddy," she said, "I got an A." He crossed the room and put his arms around her, and she accepted this with the practical confidence of a child who has always known she was the most important thing in any room she entered. And she patted his arm once and said, "It was about weather systems." "I know," Stellan said. "You told me." "I told Caleb too." "You told everyone," Caleb said. "Because it's important," Gracie said with complete and serious conviction. And then she went back to her homework. Stellan sat down. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Ruth. "Derek is in Portland," he said. "He's safe. He's been there since 2011. The records were misfiled." He stopped. "He's been making drawings, houses and trees, every week." Ruth looked at him. She didn't say, "I'm so glad," or "I knew you'd find him," or anything that would require the moment to carry more weight than it already had. She just looked at him the way she looked at things that mattered directly and without performance. And then she said, "Tell me about him." And Stellan did. He talked about Derek the way you talk about someone you've been keeping alive in your mind for 15 years, carefully at first, and then with more ease as the words found their footing, the details coming back in the way that stored things come back when the storage finally ends and the thing is simply present. Derek at 19 with the drawing, Derek's laugh, Derek's specific kindness, the kind that doesn't calculate. The way he'd always remembered the things people said about themselves and brought them back at the right moment, unrehearsed, inaccurate. Caleb listened. Outside, the stars were steady over the ridgeline, and the cold moved through Welch the way cold moves through a place that has learned to endure it. And the clubhouse on Coalfield Road held the warmth of a full evening, coffee and voices, and a child doing homework, and 3 frames on the wall that represented what had been found and what was still being sought, and what had set all of this in motion 7 years ago in a storm. The birthday card, Daddy's Angels, the ink still running blue on wet cardboard, the handwriting of a 2-year-old girl who had known something that nobody around her knew. Ruth looked at it from across the room. She had spent a long time thinking about systems, about the ways they fail and the ways they can be made not to fail, and the specific human choices that make the difference. She had built a program out of those thoughts, had staffed it with people who understood that accountability is not a department but a practice, had fought for the policies that made it harder for a Douglas Parrish to operate in the dark for 15 years while shaking hands in the light. That work was real. It mattered. She would go back to it tomorrow morning and the morning after that for as long as it needed her. But sitting in this room listening to Stellan talk about his brother watching her son hold 3 worn cards in his jacket pocket and not needing to know why he still carried them, she thought that the systems were the skeleton of the thing, the necessary structure. And the thing itself, the living part, was this: people who showed up, people who listened, people who picked up the child and walked. That was what Caleb had done 7 years ago on the worst night of his life. Not because he was exceptional, not because he had resources or training or a reason to believe it would work out, because a 2-year-old girl had pointed at a light in a storm and he had decided without deliberation that her certainty was worth more than his doubt. And because his mother had taught him the one thing that mattered: don't look away. She had taught him that, not with instructions, but with her life, with 17 years of showing up for people in their worst moments, with 14 months of fighting a system that was designed to outlast her, with the decision to walk out of a hospital in a borrowed jacket and stand in a frozen parking lot because her name was in the story and she was not going to watch it from a distance. Don't look away. He had learned it. He was practicing it now, one family at a time, in the same office that had once looked at him as if he were a problem to be managed rather than a person to be helped. Stellan finished talking about Derek. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Gracie closed her notebook, set down her pencil, and looked at the birthday card on the wall. "That's from when Caleb brought me home," she said. She said it the way she always said it, not as a story or a memory, but as a fact, the same category as weather systems and the names of rivers and the other things she had learned were simply true. Ruth looked at her, at the 9-year-old girl with the dark, steady eyes, who had once been a 2-year-old in an enormous vest, pointing at a lit window in a storm. "Yes," Ruth said, "that's exactly right." Gracie picked up her pencil and opened her notebook to the next page. The refrigerator hummed. The birthday card hung on the wall with its running ink, the words still legible, the handwriting still certain. And outside on Coalfield Road, the cold moved through Welch the way it always had, and the stars were steady over the ridgeline. And somewhere in Portland, Oregon, in a room with a window that looked out on a courtyard with a real tree, a man named Derek Briggs had set down his pencil beside a drawing of a house and a tree. The house perfectly square, the tree a circle on a stick, and had gone to sleep knowing that his brother had finally found him. as he had always known he would.